Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of Vietnam. On January 30th, 1968, during the North Vietnamese holiday of Tet on the Lunar New Year, Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army soldiers launched a massive offensive into the population centers of South Vietnam. Some 84,000 troops were involved. They attacked Saigon, 5 of the largest 6 cities, 36 out of 44 provincial capitals, and virtually every major American military installation. This was the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive, or Tet 68 as it's sometimes called, is the major turning point of the Vietnam War, but perhaps not for the reasons we might initially think. The initial attacks from North Vietnamese forces were quickly turned back. None of the cities they penetrated were captured permanently. And over the following months, as the North Vietnamese forces were driven back, they suffered enormous casualties, with American and ARVN casualties comparatively light. The Viet Cong, now out in the open in this major offensive, were virtually wiped out. There was no revolution in the South against Saigon. Militarily, the attack was an utter failure for the North Vietnamese. Politically, though, Tet was a crucial turning point. In the United States, the attack led to many questions about the Johnson administration. Americans had to ask whether we were, in fact, winning the war. We had to challenge Lyndon Johnson and his wartime policies. We had to wonder if and when it would ever end. Tet would set in motion the political forces that saw the downfall of LBJ and ultimately the beginning of the withdrawal of American forces. Planning for the Tet Offensive began in the spring of 1967, a year or so before the attack itself was launched. Leaders in the North were growing tired of a war of attrition and thought the time was ripe to demonstrate to American leaders that they were still strong and that the United States would not prevail in the long run. They also expected that the lengthy occupation by American troops in the South had accumulated frustration within the population. They thought a convincing attack would spark a revolution against the weak Saigon government. It would free the civilians to rally to their cause and would ultimately result in the unified and liberated Vietnam promised in 1945. They also thought that a powerful attack might convince the ARVN to quit. Attacks on civilian centers would demonstrate that the Saigon government and American forces were incapable of protecting them. This attack would demonstrate that the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army could attack anyone, anywhere, anytime. So they hoped that the Americans would ultimately quit, that the ARVN might also quit or at least weaken their will to fight, and that they would inspire a revolution in the South. The initial phase of the attack began in October, when the NVA launched a powerful series of attacks across the demilitarized zone into South Vietnam. These were designed to pull American forces away from the population centers of the South, which were the primary targets in the main offensive to come. These initial attacks led to fierce fighting, heavy casualties on both sides, and achieved their goal. Westmoreland did move a substantial number of American troops to the north, in fact leaving Saigon completely in the hands of ARVN defenders. By late fall, intelligence and information from prisoners and defectors indicated that a major attack was coming early in 1968. Westmoreland believed the attack would come across the demilitarized zone and continued to strengthen his forces there. He strengthened the U.S. forces at Quai San and other northern American bases. We'll talk more about Quai San a little bit later in this lecture. In January, intelligence indicated large numbers of northern forces moving on the Ho Chi Minh Trail and a possible large attack coming further to the south. Westmoreland responded by moving some numbers of American forces along the Cambodian border and a few nearer to Saigon. He also urged that ARVN forces remain on active duty even during the traditional ceasefire and holiday of Tet, the Lunar New Year. Perhaps these efforts saved Saigon from falling completely during the attack. The second phase of the operation is what Americans call the Tet Offensive, or Tet 68. This was the major attack launched on January 30th, simultaneously against so many cities and bases. Among these attacks was one against the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, which succeeded in blowing a hole through the wall at the perimeter, allowing some 19 Viet Cong commandos access to the embassy. Within a few hours, the commandos were killed or captured, and the building was secure. But that attack, much of which was filmed, made a dramatic impact on the home front. To grasp the full impact of what was happening, I invite you to watch all or some of the CBS News footage linked below in the YouTube video called Tet Offensive 1968. It gives you a sense of the real drama that Americans watched on the news as the Tet Offensive was happening. There were other attacks on important buildings in Saigon, including the Presidential Palace and MACV headquarters and neighboring air bases. ARVN forces fought to defend the city and installations effectively. American reinforcements soon arrived to help drive off the enemy. And as I've noted, there was no popular uprising in Saigon. At the same time, Viet Cong forces launched a variety of attacks. At Nha Trang, a coastal city of 120,000 people, against Kon Tum and Pleiku. Elsewhere, Viet Cong troops were intercepted in the field attempting to launch attacks. Everywhere, the attacks were driven back in fierce fighting, with heavy casualties inflicted on the enemy. The fighting spread to the Mekong Delta with similar results. The heavy losses inflicted against the Viet Cong, and the fact that many of them had made themselves known in attempting to spark a rebellion, would set back recruitment efforts by the Viet Cong for years. The Viet Cong never recovered from the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive climaxed at Hue, the traditional capital of the South, and a city of great historic significance and beauty. It had been spared attack up to that point in the war. The battle to retake Hue took over a month, as a powerful force of about 7,500 North Vietnamese Army regulars and Viet Cong elite troops held much of the city. American troops and South Vietnamese troops began to arrive to drive back the invaders, and their numbers grew as reinforcements came to the scene. NVA positions were bombarded by gunfire from U.S. naval forces positioned offshore. American aircraft bombed and strafed the enemy, and American ground troops engaged in house-to-house combat in the streets. While much of the city was recaptured by early February, enemy troops held some positions until late February, and the final few stragglers were rounded up on March 2, 1968, after a month of some of the hardest fighting of the war. Over 8,000 soldiers on both sides were killed in this battle. More than 75% of the population in the city was rendered homeless, and the historic city itself was left in ruins. As one described it, the beautiful city was a shattered, stinking hulk, its streets choked with rubble and rotting bodies. In Saigon and in Hue and elsewhere, National Liberation Force, or South Vietnamese Force HIT Squad, rounded up government and city officials, community leaders, military officers, police, priests, and teachers for re-education or execution. Foreign victims included Americans, Germans, Filipinos, and others. Such murders and torture remained even in the Nixon administration as an argument for not withdrawing American forces quickly. If Americans leave, this is what's going to happen all across South Vietnam. In our next lecture, we'll continue talking about the Tet Offensive, and particularly the siege at Khe Sanh.